In the tombs of many Egyptian nobles, large numbers of figurines called Shabti have been found. But what is a Shabti, and how did they play into the Egyptian concept of the afterlife? Today, we examine the Shabti, Pharaoh's little helpers, on this episode of Ancient Egypt and the Bible. Go to practically any museum with a section on ancient Egypt and you will see these small figurines on display called Shabti, also called Ushabti or Shawabti figures. They are often made of blue faience, but very little explanation is usually offered to explain them. At its essence, a Shabti is a replacement servant for the afterlife. But we have to clear up a misconception. It is sometimes said that Shabti were invented by Egyptian administrators in the 3rd dynasty. The story goes that the kings of Dynasty 1 and 2 used to sacrifice their bureaucrats to serve them in the afterlife. So these administrators invented the Shabti figures to avoid getting the chop. Now, this story sounds really good. Unfortunately, it is probably not true. The earliest Shabtis date to the Middle Kingdom, hundreds of years after the time human sacrifice ceased. The most likely reason that human sacrifice for royal burial ceased was because of the growth of Egyptian bureaucracy. The new king probably found that keeping an experienced group of bureaucrats was an asset as opposed to training a whole new government from scratch. It is most likely that the rise of the Shabti figure was the result of the Osiris funerary cult and myths that were popularized by the rulers of the Middle Kingdom. So, the impetus for having Shabtis was motivated by the Osirian notion of life after death. If you recall from our previous video on the Egyptian afterlife, the final destination of the human soul was to work the fields of Osiris for all eternity. So, in order to avoid working the fields, you could buy a Shabti figure who would work in your place for 1 day out of the year, while you sit under a tree drinking beer. To cover the work for the entire year, you needed to buy 360 Shabtis to cover each work day. Now, you'll notice here that it's not 365. The reason is, nobody worked the 5 festival days at the end of the year. Apparently, not even the dead worked the 5 epigomenal days. So, everyone gets that day, those 5 days off. So you needed 360. But now you have a new problem. You have 360 Shabtis that work for you, but who's going to supervise those Shabtis that are now working on your behalf? Well, they've got you covered. Shabtis can be purchased to be supervisors, and you need 1 per week. The Egyptian calendar has 12 months of 3 weeks each, so you need 36 Shabtis as supervisors. Well, then, who manages the supervisors? They still got you covered here. You can buy an additional 4 Shabtis who act as managers for your supervisors. Each of these 4 Shabtis is a manager for 1 month of every season. The Egyptian calendar was divided into 3 seasons of 4 months each. So 1 Shabti for each month of every season. So finally, who oversees the 4 managers of your supervisors? Well, you do. You don't get out of all work entirely. If this sounds like a pyramid scheme, you aren't wrong. But it is very reflective of the bureaucratic structure of ancient Egypt's bloated government administration. Overall, a complete set of Shabti figures comprises of 400. 360 workers, 36 supervisors, and 4 managers. Now, kings had complete sets, and so did several high nobles. But what if you couldn't afford a complete set of Shabti? After all, Shabti figures were expensive. If you couldn't afford the most lavish of burials, one did not need to buy an entire set of Shabti. Some Egyptians only bought as many Shabti as they could afford. Thus, we find tombs with relatively small numbers of Shabti. In some tombs, we find only 6 Shabti, all of which kind of mismatch in artistic styles. This seems to indicate that these Shabti were purchased over a long period of time, so you could buy Shabti on an installment plan. Convenient. And since Shabti tire easily, the deceased often provided a wooden chest for the Shabtis to find rest when they are not working. That way, they will work well when they have to work their one day the following year. So, that explains Shabti in a nutshell. Pharaoh's little helpers. Anyway, I hope you found this video interesting. I hope you learned something. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time on Ancient Egypt and the Bible.